Welcome everyone to another episode of the Gold Silver Bitcoin Show, brought to you by the GoldSilverBitcoin.com store. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are more than honored to be joined today by Nik Bhatia. He's writing at Substack, the Bitcoin Layer. We're going to get into a little bit about Bitcoin today. So thank you so much for joining us, Nik.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So I guess as a kind of top of the kind of a 30,000 foot view of the Bitcoin discussion, could you describe what the Bitcoin layer is insofar as you see it?
The Bitcoin Layer, my publication, is an opportunity to describe the transition of Bitcoin toward a world reserve currency status. So Bitcoin is approximately 13 years old now, and it has attained about 1 trillion in market valuation, which in itself is an amazing rise in a short time. And I believe that Bitcoin is on a track to becoming a reserve asset and a world denomination. And that belief is what I'm describing at the Bitcoin layer. So for example, when we see in Russia and Ukraine, we have a war in Eastern Europe, but at the same time, Ukrainian military forces are raising money in Bitcoin. Ukrainian citizens are fleeing their town with Bitcoin wallets, basically the only way that they're carrying money because they're not able to smuggle cash or electronic bank money in any way out of the country. And then you have Russians that are cut off from the world that are now increasingly using Bitcoin. And then you have the Russian government, of course, considering Bitcoin for cross-border transactions. They're not employing that tool quite yet, but it's in the conversation there. So it's in the conversation on both sides of the war, on good and evil, at the citizen level and at the government level. And that is an example of Bitcoin becoming a reserve asset, a world currency. And that's what I'm hoping to describe with my Substack publication.
So hyper Bitcoinization, the Bitcoin standard, the Bitcoin layer. Would you agree that all of these are essentially, I guess, if not kind of specific or like a specific avenue of thought within this overarching hyper Bitcoinization theme, or names for the same phenomenon? Would you agree that it's akin to that?
So the Bitcoin standard and hyper Bitcoinization, I believe, are quite different from the Bitcoin layer, which I'm describing. Okay, and I'll break that down a little bit. Okay, you'll start with hyper Bitcoinization. Hyper Bitcoinization is a theory that the world will rapidly adopt Bitcoin as its primary and perhaps only denomination. I don't necessarily agree with that. I believe in a slow and steady Bitcoinization process. Okay, so that's where I differ from the hyper Bitcoinization. The Bitcoin standard is theoretically much more, much closer to what I'm talking about. But a Bitcoin standard is a little different in that the Bitcoin standard describes a country, or let's say a person or a company adopting Bitcoin as its primary denomination. Okay, and I believe that many are and will do that. So I believe in the Bitcoin standard in its way, but the Bitcoin layer describes this Bitcoin asset, which people are either in part or fully redenominating their books and also their mental accounting. So when we think about, trying to become a millionaire, for example, people are now thinking, oh, I want to have 10 Bitcoin. And that's my idea of wealth. And so that's like a mental denomination. So the Bitcoin layer describes an asset that we can go from other assets into and out of, and it can be a standard. not the standard, but it can be a standard for some. It can be a partial standard or a dual standard. And so I strongly agree with this idea of a Bitcoin standard. So I would say it's a lot more, lot closer to the Bitcoin standard than hyper Bitcoinization, for example. But there are nuances there, and I'm trying to describe the freedom that we have to choose Bitcoin, either in part or in whole, and slowly also as Bitcoin grows and it proves itself out.
What is the overall effect of people changing the way in which they account in the real world from fiat currency to Bitcoin, or not even only fiat currency, by the way, kind of trendy knickknacks oftentimes seem to be popular. Anyway, so let's just leave it simple at like fiat currency, for instance, and then switching from that to Bitcoin.
There's a large implication for people that are doing that, or companies or countries that are going to do that, because what you're saying is that we are going to trust an algorithmic monetary policy that is in front of us and openly known in advance for the next century. So basically for all of our lifetimes, the people that are making this decision, in our lifetime, this monetary policy will be known. And so it is a delinkage from the trust-based fiat system. And that's why I believe that won't happen rapidly. That's why I don't believe in a rapid transition. I believe that actually getting people to mentally account in a different not computer-based necessarily, but a known and fixed future in terms of the denomination. And the known versus the unknown is the big shift. And it's going to have, large implications for the world.
We're at an inflection point, and I think that's generally understood now. And this inflection point, I suppose we can look in the West back to even, let's just 9/11, 2008 financial crisis, COVID, and now the West versus Russia, as it's been painted so far, conflict, that the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which was kind of the spurring thereof. Now, Bitcoin also, I think, has a role in this inflection point, and admittedly, it's a small role at the nation state level to this point. El Salvador, I think, is a significant step also. And I guess what we're seeing is the floating of this idea of a multipolar world by particularly Russia and China, as well as many scholars in the West as well, versus I suppose, the continuation of a Western dominated world, as we've seen as Russia and China paints it, in terms of, as we've seen in the Bretton Woods arrangement, in which at post World War II, the Allies came together and agreed for a U.S. based world reserve currency monetary system. Back then, the dollar was backed by gold. This changed in about 1971, 1972, which I would posit is really the end of the Bretton Woods agreement, quite frankly. I don't know if it was written into the contract that the U.S. had unilateral control over the U.S. monetary policy. It must have been that, or rather that the contract stated that the nature of the dollar could change. The very nature of the dollar could change, and the agreement was to stand. I don't know what the language in the treaty is. However, in 1971, I believe it was, there's a big change when Nixon closes the gold window and isn't buying gold back from banks. And we've kind of, we saw immediate crisis in the 70s, and then kind of, I guess, a stagnation since then, really. although I suppose that stagnation has been papered over to a large degree. So I was thinking about the roaring 20s today, and you can imagine how only very few people were benefiting from the wild speculation of the roaring 20s. Most people were probably in a stagnant economic situation, very similar to what we're seeing today. With this background, do you kind of view Bitcoin having this multi-decade or century impact and playing a role in these multi-century or multi-decade and century narratives?
Yes. The over the long term, I do believe that Bitcoin, it fits perfectly into this idea of a multipolar world. And I believe that the state as we know it in its current form will has reached a peak. And it the state in its importance will begin to decline or has begun to decline. And for that reason alone, the unipolar world of the United States cannot set policy for the world and expect the world to follow the United States policy. So in that way, we're in a multipolar world where the US itself doesn't have the influence, and also governments themselves are losing the influence. And it really is 100% due to the internet and the offspring of the internet, which is social network, Bitcoin, and the rest. And so technology has changed the equation for the lay of the land of our geopolitical system. And Bitcoin itself is a unifying force that I believe will have a multi-decade and perhaps, who knows about centuries, but we're talking about the next few decades where Bitcoin as an independent nation state per se of technologists becomes stronger and stronger and becomes even stronger than many of the existing nation states. So yes.
So now this makes me think of the Marxist concept coined by Friedrich Engels, the withering away of the state. It's a Marxist concept that states with the realization of socialism, the social institution of a state will eventually become obsolete and disappear as a society will be able to govern itself without the state and its coercive enforcement of the law. Okay, so I'm going to read a longer quote because I think I haven't gone into this in a very long time and I might not know what I'm talking about. So, quote, the interference of the state power in social relations becomes superfluous in one sphere after another and then ceases of itself. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things and the direction of the processes of production. Okay, the administration of things. Okay, we should, can I get a definition for that, Mr. Engels? And so then the direction of the processes of production, I guess that's a little bit clearer. I mean, they're both kind of clear, but what's the practical application? Anyway, back to the quote. The state is not, quote, abolished, it withers away. Der Staat wird nicht abgeschafft, stirbt ab. The state is not abolished, it atrophies. I mean, in so many ways, we're describing the same thing here. What's the difference?
Well,
so in terms of like
yeah.
outcome, now where we might disagree is in the quote administration of things. Now that sounds bureaucratic, and I'm not sure bureaucratic solutions are the solutions to most problems. Then the direction of the processes of production. What is that even mean? What does that even mean? All right. Any thoughts?
So, I mean, I think that the
let me
that
finish. I
yeah,
hate to keep
go ahead.
interrupting you, but
No, it's okay.
the processes of production. So what they're saying is like, now that's supply and demand. And there's no human element here. Notice that there's no mention of humanity. There's no mention of nothing. It's just like machine-like processes. And I think that language is dangerous. Anyway, go ahead.
Yes, I agree with you because Bitcoin is about the independent spirit and people taking control of their own money and deciding in this stateless, technology-based consensus. So, there's a great degree of there's a great degree of restriction in some of that language, like the processes, the bureaucracies. Well, bureaucracies are important, I believe, for certain, social services, things like that. So I believe that governments will continue to exist in their current form, but they'll lose their role when it comes to other things in the monetary realm, for example, and also in the trade realm, because once you de-link the government from money, uh, you're talking about the government losing its role in a lot of trade. Then we're left with social services that aren't global trade or monetary based, but that are just fundamental necessities. So that type of thing is a lot of speculation, but that's how I think about the future. Is that Bitcoin has the ability to disassociate the state from a lot of things that they shouldn't be involved with, because those are, let's say, uh, the credit money system awards those that are closest to the ability to issue credit, and that has, I think, that has corrupted our system in a lot of ways, our society as well. And so Bitcoin has the role to disrupt that, and but in a over a very long time horizon, and in a way that actually the United States can capitalize from greatly because of its affinity for independence and the individual and the individual's right to protect his or her property. And so Bitcoin, it's a speech that I gave last year. Bitcoin is an American ideal. And so there's a lot there that links Bitcoin to the United States, some of its fundamental values. And in that way, I think the United States and Bitcoin make a great pair.
This echoes what individuals such as Mike McAlone have stated. The government of persons, like this is what this was Engels called it. Now this seems to be also where many of the checks and balances and rights are preserved as well, heretofore throughout human history and today in the present. And so these must be, I guess, preserved in that, I guess, west as Patrick Byrne notes, what's historically been called liberalism, what might today be also known as classical liberalism, as opposed to, like, for instance, social liberalism, and um, also the libertarian movement, also, which has become a kind of a bad word increasingly as of late. Now, so in 1878, Engels wrote the last quote. Now, there's a related quote from Engels in his Origins of the Family, Private Property and the State, 1884, so 6 years later. Quote, "The society which organizes production anew on the basis of free and equal association of the producers will put the whole state machinery where it will then belong, into the Museum of Antiquities, next to the spinning wheel and the bronze axe." Now, my critique there is similar as before, in that we have checks and balances and rights preserved in this, quote, state machinery at present, and in all the ways in which it's overstepped its bounds, it's also a tool, a potential tool that can be used to kind of like in the spirit of Bitcoin, in the spirit of these Western philosophies of, I guess, enlightenment, as well as classical liberalism, libertarianism, the American values. Thoughts?
Yes, the classic liberalism and Bitcoin are, I believe, strongly related, because they're both about the empowerment of the individual, and you have to step into the shoes of somebody that's not in the United States, maybe in a country that has a terrible record on currency stability. relative to our country. And from that perspective, Bitcoin is infinitely more empowering to the individual than it is to one in the United States. So I like to think of liberalism through that lens, not having anything to do with our country, but just the ability of the individual to take control of his or her monetary rights and by association property rights through this algorithm. And the algorithm is, we know that it's gone 13 years without changing, and from that we can project out another maybe 1300 years that it will go without changing. So I think that the evidence, the empirical evidence of nobody being able to influence the supply schedule and the difficulty adjustment to fundamental components of the Bitcoin protocol and how it works and secures itself and secures the rules of the system. And we have 13 years of empirical data that it's unchanged. That grows so much. That's the idea that's commonly quoted, that every day that Bitcoin doesn't die, it gets stronger. And so the Lindy effect. And so that's what Bitcoin is dealing with. And the people on the planet that have recognized that, not just Americans, but anybody that has recognized that and has seized the day and taken advantage of that to redenominate their mental accounting or their actual physical accounting in Bitcoin, it's very powerful and empowering.
Dare I go out on a limb and say that if we can posit the US's ability to preserve, individual liberty for 200 plus years, you're saying that Bitcoin will have done 10 times as much for individual liberty than the US did. Where do you come up with that number, I suppose?
So let's not maybe quantify it, right? But let's say that with the property rights that have been protected over long term in the United States, and it hasn't been without error or fault, right? Because people unjustly have their property seized. We have the history of seizing the land from the natives themselves in terms of the European settlers. You have all sorts of displacement in terms of property rights, and you have cases that fill the courts with arguments over property rights. And who am I to say that the court is on the right side of the law every time that they rule, right? The court can be missing on the correct property right judgment all across the country every day of the year. So we have a protection of property rights here and a system that works, but that isn't without victims. Bitcoin protects people's money from, let's say, policymakers, for example, and bankers. Those are the two people that are two groups that are involved with the jurisdiction over the money that we use, let's say the dollar, right? And it's subject to policymakers and to bankers and their behavior and their actions. So, and there's zero appeal in Bitcoin in terms of trying to change issuance. There actually is an appeal process, but we've seen that, with the block size war in 2017, for example, that it's not possible for a group to influence Bitcoin. And so there is a relative advance in property rights that is coming from Bitcoin and the monetary policy that it ensures.
And I wanted to spend a little time on the experience of the Native Americans and also kind of their use of money historically. So for one, there used to be potlatch, and this is from projects.exeter.ac.uk, R. Davies. The potlatch ceremonies of Native Americans were a form of barter that had social and ceremonial functions that were at least as important as its economic functions. Consequently, when the potlatch was outlawed in Canada by an act that was later repealed, some of the most powerful work incentives were removed to the detriment of the younger sections of the Indian communities, which I think dovetails with this concept, as Ron Paul put it at Bitcoin 2021, of painting Bitcoin in the context of monetary choice, namely. Another also, so now speaking about monetary choice a little bit further in terms of I suppose Native American civilization, um, you can look back and see that the Incas in Peru had reached a high level of civilization without the use of money, according to the historiography. In Mexico, the Aztecs and Mayas used gold dust kept in transparent quills and cocoa beans kept for large payments in sacks of 24,000 as money. The best known form of money among the Native Americans north of Mexico is wampum, made out of the shells of a type of clam. However, its use was not confined to the coastal states, but spread far inland, e.g., the powerful Iroquois amassed large quantities by way of tribute. Wampun's use of money undoubtedly came about as an extension of his desirability for ornamentation. Beads of it were strung together in short lengths of about 18 inches, or much longer ones of about 6 feet. Now, I think when we're looking at furthermore kind of Bitcoin in the context of the American tradition, we see at Bitcoin 2021, for instance, senators like Cynthia Lummis and Congressman Warren Davidson speaking in the U.S. tradition. One parallel I see between kind of the Constitution, Bill of Rights, and the system of the U.S. governance and Bitcoin is the decentralization, which comes with the checks and balances. That is 3 branches of government. Another one is the states, which I think is an important one that's been in many ways, I think, whittled down. Now, the states' rights thing, that gives you 50 different types of jurisdictions, which gives individuals a choice under what kind of society they want to live in. Can you speak to the ways in which I guess this Western thought and decentralization and Bitcoin all kind of come together?
Yes, that's an interesting point about the 3 branches of government and the checks and balances. The checks and balances is definitely something that exists in this node architecture of Bitcoin, where every node operator has a check and balance on the system. And the internet itself allows us to share information. So for example, if there's a bug or something wrong, we could all know right away about it and check and balance the system. So, but then on the states' rights issue, I think that's an important point, because what we're seeing in Texas, for example, is an obsession with Bitcoin that's growing. And it's fascinating to see that Texas is becoming, Christopher Calicott likes to say, Texas is Bitcoin country. And he's absolutely right, because the people that are drawn to Bitcoin recognize that people are in Texas building with Bitcoin and then the state, at the state level, they've recognized virtual currency as an important structure in their society itself, and are passing legislation through, and have policymakers constantly working on things, not to mention the energy overlay, where you have an energy culture that understands the fundamentals about energy consumption and energy production and how that relationship operates. And they see Bitcoin mining as an incredible opportunity to harness energy. And so the Texas energy culture combined with the classic liberalism of the Texan spirit are making Texas the home of Bitcoin on the planet. And I can say that from a personal perspective, spending some time, 3 times and 3 visits to Texas last year that were all Bitcoin related. And you can definitely feel it when you're there. And so I think that you don't even need the United States government to give flashing green lights for Texas to become the Bitcoin capital of the world. It's almost official already. I think many would argue that it's already official. Some would say that it's becoming that, but I think that's where the the track that we're on, and it sets up very well for the future of Texas.
I had Robert Keent on of Gold Silver Pros, and he highlights apparent efforts by Texas state government to attract commodities exchanges to the state by various avenues. He also posits that there have been efforts in Texas to create a kind of alternative to COMEX and store precious metals. And now we also know that, and some of this is just in writing, so it's kind of I don't want to say that they're doing anything, certainly, just saying, passing along Robert's message. And then also in Texas, there is Bitcoin mining going on. Seems that there has been kind of an effort to crowd that, but also by other states, including Wyoming. Therefore, I mean, could Texas become the capital center of the New World Order? I suppose we will see. Stay tuned. Now, I suppose I do want to talk a little bit about Texas a little bit. I do also want to maybe lead that up with a discussion about kind of energy-based currency and some of the thinking there, or digital currency. So like according to some, our Buckminster Fuller was the first person to publicly propose the idea of a metabolic currency based on electricity, the global energy grid, in 1969. Fuller stated, quote, because energy is wealth, the integrating world industrial networks promise ultimate access of all humanity everywhere to the total operative commonwealth of Earth, as he put it. In a reply to an 11-year-old who asked about solving violence, Fuller wrote, I quote, I always try to solve problems by some artifact, some tool or invention that makes what people are doing obsolete so that it makes this particular kind of problem no longer relevant. My answer would be to develop a world energy grid and electric grid where everybody is on the same grid. All of a sudden, there would be no problems anymore, no international troubles whatsoever, he says. Our new economic basis wouldn't be gold or dollars, it would be kilowatt hours. So you take from that what you will. In 1984, Hayek had also made a prediction. It's a little bit different in nature. He essentially stated that there would be a digital currency. I don't believe we shall ever have a good money again before we take the thing out of the hands of government. That is, we can't take them violently out of the hands of government. All we can do is some sly, roundabout way to introduce something they can't stop. The one thing that's missing, but that will soon be developed, said American economist Milton Friedman, is a reliable e-cash in 1999, a method where buying on the internet, you can transfer funds from A to B without A knowing B or B knowing A, the way in which I can take a $20 bill and hand it over to you, and there's no record of where it came from. And you may get that without knowing who I am. That kind of thing will develop on the internet. So with particular allusion to the prediction by Hayek as well as Buckminster Fuller, what more can you say about the mining process and why it, I suppose, is such a powerful alternative to intermediary-based money?
The mining process is what secures the network, and it secures the it secures from the network from anyone trying to change it. And the more mining hash power that we have on the network, the more set in stone the rules of Bitcoin are. And so that's why it's so important. That's why energy and Bitcoin are linked. And Bitcoin definitely has the ability to affect energy consumption patterns and production patterns around the world on the long term. So I think Texas will be a great place to flesh that idea out, because previously the hash power coming from China, we weren't able to really dissect how that was impacting the energy grid and production and consumption patterns. So we have to wait and see what happens in Texas. One of the things that Texans are very ashamed about is this big freeze that they had recently, where the grid shut off, and they are a very proud people and realize that this is a massive fail for the state and everybody involved, that this happened to them. And I think it's that the sting of that big freeze is going to, combined with Bitcoin and then Bitcoin mining advocates demonstrating how Bitcoin mining can be shut off in order to contribute to an energy deficiency at the societal level, and that miners would be willing to sacrifice the marginal revenue or profit in order to help the society if there's a symbiotic relationship there. I mean, that's incredible stuff. So mining is very important and a big part of what Bitcoin is and its security and its place in a world that demands energy consumption too.
So then it would make sense that it would be better in general for Bitcoin and Bitcoin's mining apparatus to be not only like decentralized around the world, that is global and distributed or decentralized, but also in jurisdictions, namely where there is a tradition of, I suppose, individual liberty, et cetera, such as we've seen in Texas, even in contraposition to even places like New York. Would you agree?
Yes. So the energy grid aspect of it and how the energy grid will play out, and the potential decentralization of that, I think it's really hard to speculate there. I'm also not an energy expert in any way. So I think that, trying to project that Bitcoin is going to have a great impact on energy grids around the world is early to say. I think we have to watch how that plays out in places like Texas. That's why I bring that up, because if it works and if there's something empirically that we can point to, then the rest of the world can adopt it. And from the liberalism perspective, energy production is significantly regulated essentially everywhere in the world, right? In many countries, there's only one gas station, right? It's the state, for example. And in many countries, there's only one producer, and it's the state. And so let's say, there's underwater drilling that's available off the coast of a certain country. The odds are that the state that oil deposit is next to is controlling that oil deposit. The odds are that they have not sold it off in an auction process in some sort of, quote unquote, fair and open process like we would have in the United States, right? And so from that perspective also, we will be able to see where mining is embraced from the liberalism perspective, because many places around the world, people will not be able to unlock that energy arbitrage that Bitcoin allows for. Why? Because arbitrage means buy one thing and sell another. Well, they won't be able to buy the energy to sell the Bitcoin that they mine. They simply will not be able to buy the energy, so they won't be able to engage in arbitrage.
I've been researching a little bit about alternative energy sources, and I have spoken on this show to a gentleman who runs a company called Patriot Energy Systems, and they're essentially like self-sustaining portable solar panels that are designed for somebody whose house is to be living off grid, who's it's designed for somebody who wants to power their home largely totally off grid. However, I think his market is largely with people who are on off grid. Can you speak to, I guess, some of these alternative technologies that Bitcoin can leverage? So, for instance, there's a number of ways in which mesh networks come to mind. So that there's a way in which for Bitcoin to interoperate with mesh networks, which I think people don't understand. Do you have any comments on like alternative systems for running Bitcoin itself as off of the ClearNet?
Yes, I think that is a very important evolution of Bitcoin. Mesh networks, satellites, off-grid energy to sustain the nodes and mining. All of that is important for the decentralization of Bitcoin and a slow and steady process as well. So I think that one of the great things about Bitcoin is that the contributions to Bitcoin are all self-driven. And what we see is that people are passionate about so many different things. And there are people out there that are obsessed with getting Bitcoin onto mesh networks, people that are obsessed with building Bitcoin mining with renewable off-grid technology, energy, and people obsessed with the satellite network, sustaining Bitcoin, et cetera, right? And then, like the SMS Bitcoin transaction service as well. All these backups and backups of backups and new ideas of backups and new ideas to decentralize and new ideas to get off of the main internet in terms of redundancy. So these are all technologies that are exciting to follow. They're not something that I'm actively following, let's say, but I always love to hear what people are doing on the fringes of Bitcoin, because that's where the development is sometimes the most exciting.
What have you been covering as of late at the bitcoinlayer.substack.com?
Thank you for asking. I'm basically covering this transition of Bitcoin to world reserve currency. However, at the moment, I am stuck on what the Fed is up to, because I have a history in the interest rate market. I was a treasuries trader for many years and an interest rate strategist as well. And so my understanding of the monetary system and of Fed policy, it has taken over my writing of late as interest rates are back on the front page again. So I've been writing a lot about the Fed, what the Fed is doing, but also trying to cover Bitcoin and its role in the evolving monetary system. The Russia-Ukraine war has been an interesting an interesting test case or a case study of how Bitcoin fits into this modern monetary world that we're in, which is nothing to do with modern monetary theory, not to confuse the two, but no, just this new era of money that we're in now that the Fed and the ECB have demonstrated they will seize reserves if it's geopolitically appropriate to do so. And Russia realizing that their move to sell all their treasuries 3 to 4 years ago was wise. And it was a geopolitical decision back then and a wise one for them because they were able to redirect some of their wealth. So basically, I'm covering these current events, grand geopolitical events, monetary policy, and how Bitcoin fits into all of that. So I hope people will join me and subscribe.
Okay, so when it comes to Russia, do you see there is a chance of them adopting Bitcoin or perhaps opening up a Bitcoin window with banks?
So the second one is likely, I would say. So I don't think that the next way forward for nations is going to be an outright Bitcoin as legal tender or Bitcoin as a parallel standard. It will be a legalization of Bitcoin to be used as a banking rail, and then allowing Bitcoin to integrate into the economy as a second and parallel denomination. So it won't be an outright declaration of Bitcoin as a parallel denomination necessarily. I'm not projecting, let's say, what Russia is going to do specifically, but I think that nations will introduce Bitcoin as a banking tool that can be used without undue taxation, basically as a currency. And that will allow further integration of Bitcoin into economies around the world. And in that way, we'll have this slow and steady Bitcoinization.
I'm curious, what do you think the logic behind the move of El Salvador is? Do you think there's a deeper logic other than just, I suppose, adopting Bitcoin as legal tender? Do you think that there could be serious long-term geopolitical consequences?
So let's say that there are between 100 and 200 million people around the world that own Bitcoin in some way. And that way we're talking about tens of millions of people that are genuine Bitcoin enthusiasts. And then we're still talking about millions of people that are diehard zealots. The odds are now in the favor that at least one of those people is the head of a nation state. And we have that with Bukele in El Salvador. We have basically someone who is a Bitcoin zealot that also runs a country. And he was the first to introduce Bitcoin as legal tender because he believed that it could affect his country for the better. And the story will unfold, and we'll get to look back, I think, in a matter of 2 or 3 years, we'll get to look back and really see, did this help El Salvador as a nation? Did it help its people? Did it raise up people? Did it raise up the economy? Were people allowed to preserve their property rights? How are things going over there? All of those things, it's way too early to judge, I believe. And I'm optimistic. I have close friends that have moved there to El Salvador as a result of this. It's something I've also written about at the Bitcoin Layer. Max Kaisi and Stacy Herbert, the dynamic Bitcoin orange pilling duo. They're friends, and they've moved to El Salvador, and I'm really optimistic, let's say, but I'm not going on any victory lap. But it's absolutely a great case study when we get here into like a 2 or 3 year look back period.
I suppose a reasonable goal would be to become a regional player, considerable player for El Salvador and Bukele.
That's a great point. Does Central America have a really big international level economic hub? Well, Panama has filled more or less that banking role in the region. So, but then as like a great international open banking center that's not really about laundering US dollars or any of that type of stuff. Where do you think the term Panama Papers comes from? So I agree with you. I think that would be a great signpost.
We've had the honor and privilege of sitting down today with Nik Bhatia. You can find his work at thebitcoinlayer.substack.com. Where else, Nick, can people find you and your work?
Thanks, Justin. I enjoyed this conversation a lot. Everyone can find all my links at layeredmoney.com. Layered Money is the title of my book I published last January, and it's about the evolution of the monetary system from gold and dollars to Bitcoin and central bank digital currencies. And so people can find all my links, including the Substack link or links to the Amazon and my Twitter, all at layeredmoney.com.
I'm just looking over Nick's Substack right now, and there's articles such as topics covering the good, the bad, the totalitarian. Bitcoin was built for a multipolar world, and also coverage of the Fed, as Nick mentioned. Thank you so much, Nick, for joining us today. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Have a great day.